So we explored the Highlands. We're looking at some Talisman Tactica. And the Highlands, the mountains, we've got to complement it with the dungeon. And that's what we're going to explore and framework in this Tactica vlog. So at its core, the dungeon kind of mirrors the Highlands very nicely. You go in, there's going to be some encounters, there's going to be some monsters, there's going to be some followers, and you're going to make it to the end where instead of facing the Eagle King, you're facing the Lord of Darkness, aka, depending on the edition of Talisman that you have, the Games Workshop Chaos Knight. There's some interesting treasures in there. There are. Now, I'm not going to spoil it. That's up to you to discover, but they are all really good, and there are some that are extremely, insanely powerful. Now, how you handle those as a player, there's a lot of different ways, and I've experimented with them. One of the ways is rules as written. It's random, right? Shuffle up the cards, pick one, there you go. Other ways, some players will play, you can see all the treasure cards, depending on the edition of Talisman that you have that you want to play, and you can mix and match. You see all the treasure cards, you get to pick one. Another way, kind of midway that we sometimes play to embrace the random but give you some agency of choice, is to mix up the cards. You randomly select 3, flip them over, and you get to pick the best one that you want. The treasures in the dungeon, that is the focus. You could dip into the dungeon for a little bit of experience, but the encounters tend to be, generally speaking, much more difficult. There's a lot more 5+ strength and craft and higher encounters. There's a lot more random cards that smash you. There's a lot more encounters that also have a special ability. Before combat, do this. After combat, take this. Roll this to see what happens, in addition to other events and traps. The dungeon, rightly so, is very, very lethal. So this is not something, generally speaking, that I'll dip into a little bit to try and get some gear or some followers and then jump out. You want to plan. You want to plan for your dungeon raid. Now, in terms of Tactica, we need to pull this framework in. You've got the beginning of the game, you've got mid-game, you've got end-game, and then you have the final piece, which is the run for the Crown of Command, or the Crown of Command where there'll be a random event or an alternate ending. At different parts of the game, you're focusing on different things. In the beginning of the game, I'm not jumping into the dungeon. There's more of a chance I'm going to get stomped and lose turns or get my character killed than the risk versus reward. I want to do that mid-game, where I've leveled up a little bit. You know, I've got a +2 or +3 craft and strength, depending on the path I'm going. I've got a couple of followers. Maybe I have a potion or a trinket that I can suddenly boost with. Right before combat, go into the Lord of Darkness, boost it, roll an extra D6, that type of stuff. That's really when I want to go in and focus it. But compared to the Highlands, where I will say the Eagle King is optional, you really want to try and go and get the dungeon and go for the Chaos Knight, the Lord of Darkness, whatever we're going to call it. 2 side Tactica to keep in mind. And this is going to be dependent on how many players in the game, the characters, and the other expansions in play. Sometimes you draw a character that just is not going to work. It's either not a very powerful character, or the synergy of the other characters that you're playing, it's just not worth it. Or sometimes, depending on the enthusiasm of the group, sometimes you draw the best character, one of the top 5 characters in the game. That's not a good place to be either if we're playing a game with 5 or 6 players, because everyone is going to constantly work to nullify you and to beat you up and steal your stuff. You're going to be fighting the players as part of your main strategy, as opposed to kind of a side strategy. So there are times where you want to get killed and draw another character. You run into the dungeon. The times that I sometimes have to get killed, I will run into the dungeon and hopefully draw one of those cards that's more powerful than average. So if you need to character dump, that is the way to do it. Another interesting tactica for the dungeon is setting a trap for players. Now, we're going to look at this from the ideal perspective, because I don't really want to hang out in the dungeon that long. I'm going to talk about the rune sword. It is an object. It's illustrative an object. There are some magic objects in the game that are extremely powerful. If you have these objects, like, just wow. If you're playing with 5 or 6 players, they're going to now be targeting you. Destroy object, mug you, steal it from you, try to totify you, have you drop everything, and they're going to try and steal it. The object is so powerful, they can't let you have it. Sometimes what I'll do is, if I have one of those objects and I realize I'm playing with 5 or 6 players that are very skilled at the game, they're not going to let me keep this object. They can't. They can't. I'm not going to be sad face or upset. They can't. Then if I can't destroy the object, like if I'm not the alchemist or a character that can just destroy it and bring it out of play, I'll run into the dungeon. I will drop that off deep, deep, deep in the dungeon. And especially if it's early game or mid game, where I'm not powerful enough to fight off the other characters and it's back and forth, and I can drop it in there and have them go in there and get killed doing it, which when they get killed drops all their stuff, and the dungeon is just like a self-feeding treasure pile. It's interesting to see who will go after the gear at that place. Now, if they do make it, they get it all, but they burned a couple of turns doing that. I say the ideal tactic because in this example, let's say it's early game, turn 10. We've got a couple of items, we've got some gear, maybe I leveled up one, and I draw the rune sword. That's boss, that's great, but now everyone's going to target me. Ideally, I want to have some way that I can move fast into the dungeon. Teleport to any space, fast move with a magic object or a potion or a brew, somewhere where I can roll 2 dice, get in, drop it, and roll 2 dice and get out of there, because I don't want to get killed myself in the dungeon. But that's kind of a sub-tactica where if you need to get your character killed because just the draw is not good, early game, head into the dungeon. Or if you draw an object that you can't destroy, that everyone's going to fight over, or you want them to fight over it, drop it in the dungeon. That'll buy you a number of game turns. But outside of that, plan to fight the Lord of Darkness. Plan to fight the Chaos Knight, because some of that gear is literally, with combos and other things, game changing.